Elaine is, just want to give you a little bit of background on our author. She was born and raised in New York City. She is a journalist, and her work has appeared in the New York Times, Atlantic Monthly, Harper's, the Boston Globe, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and she has been a presenter on National Public Radio. She currently works as a correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor. Her new book, which you'll see the cards for, is on women's right to vote, and it will be published by Viking Press in March 2018. So I hope you'll join us in welcoming Elaine Weiss.
Thank you, Eileen. Can you hear me? No. Can you hear me now? Better. Okay. Let me see how directional this is. Can I read and speak at the same time? How about that? Is that okay? Okay, great. Let me know if I go off mic in any way. I want to introduce to you a figure in American history and New Jersey history that you've probably never encountered before. Here she is, the Farmerette, that's what she was called, of the Women's Land Army of America during the First World War. And here are New Jersey Farmerettes. She's quite famous at this time during World War I. She's celebrated as a heroine of the home front. She is the girl with the hoe behind the man with the gun. She's called the soldier of the soil, and she is scything for Uncle Sam. She's also called the Patriot Farmerette. The public adores her at this time. Her pictures appear in every newspaper and magazine. The Newark News, the Ladies' Home Journal, New Republic, House Beautiful, Scientific American, they all carry articles about her exploits. She's featured in all the cinema newsreels. If you went to the cinema in an afternoon, you'd have a double feature and you'd see war newsreels, and I think there are some of them here, and she would often appear. Her character appeared on Broadway, also in the Ziegfeld Follies, and in short stories and cartoons and poems. She was really ubiquitous during the war. She'd become an icon of American women's patriotism and pluck. And this wonderful poster by Charles Dana Gibson for the New Jersey Women's Land Army. There were more than 20,000 Farmerettes, Land Army women, in uniform in about 25 states during the war, with thousands more women working behind the scenes to provide financial and logistical and political support to ease their way. And yet, today, almost no one knows who the Farmerette was, or what she did, or why this Land Army, a civilian, volunteer, woman-organized, woman-financed enterprise, it was never a government operation, never, is such a colorful part of America's and New Jersey's participation in the war. Here's another view of the Farmerettes, and this is a special one to me. This is a Land Army unit in Vermont, and I learned about the Land Army from this woman. See if I can point her out right here. Her name was Alice Hallway, and she's 18 years old in this picture. And 60 years after this photo was taken, she told me how she had done her bit and how proud she was to have served her country as a farmerette. And that's how I first learned about it. So to understand what Alice's service meant to a nation at war and to American women entering the 20th century, we really need to step back a little into the first weeks before America entered the war. In early 1917, food was an anxious issue. You don't usually think about food being a wartime problem before we go into the war, but it was. In Europe, where the war had been raging for 3 years already, millions of people were starving, and the men had been called away to fight, leaving the crops to rot in the fields. In Great Britain, where food rationing had just begun, the situation was so dire that women on their own began to organize themselves into squads and to go into the fields and rescue the crops. And there were tens of thousands of women enrolled in what was called a women's land army. And here's one of their great posters. They were known as land lassies, and though they encountered initial resistance, they became an essential part of the war effort there. Some critics called them the Lilac Sunbonnet Brigade, but they were really essential to the war effort. And I love the theme on this: Godspeed the plow and the woman who drives it. In early 1917, America was still neutral in the war. President Woodrow Wilson had just won re-election under the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But Americans could see war coming, and they feared they saw hunger coming too, as it had in Europe. In February 1917, food riots erupted in New York City and in major cities around the world. Here is a picture of New York City. Thousands of women set fire to produce carts, don't try this at home, smashed butcher shops, and stormed City Hall to protest the high price of food. European demand for American food, coupled with war speculators, had tripled or quadrupled the price of basic necessities overnight. Police had to subdue the rioting housewives, as they were called, with their clubs, and the riots went on for most of a week. The food riots spread to Philadelphia, where one man was shot dead and an old woman was trampled by a mob. Protests continued in Cincinnati, in Chicago. Congress held hearings. There were fears that hunger could bring broad civil unrest. Remember, the Russian Revolution had just begun and it had been sparked by bread riots. So there was great fear that that could happen here. So when America entered the war in the first week of April of 1917, food riots were still echoing in people's ears. It had just happened in February and March. And the nation's food supply became a major concern. How are we going to feed our allies across the water and have enough left to feed ourselves? Asked an editorial in the New York Times. The Wall Street Journal agreed. No matter how many and urgent are our problems in our war preparations, let it be remembered that victory may depend upon the food supply. And just days after declaring war, President Woodrow Wilson appealed to the nation's farmers to plant additional food crops. Upon the farmers of this country, in large measure, he said, rests the fate of the war and the fate of the nation. And here you see a cartoon where a farmer is sharpening his spade. Food will win the war became an official government slogan. And here you see, if you went again to the cinema, you would find that this card would come up. Of course, they're silent films at this time. And you would see this come up, that this was an official food will win the war. And here it was translated into different languages for immigrant groups. But there was one major problem with this idea of food will win the war and farmers should plant more crops. They couldn't, because they didn't have enough farmhands to help them bring it in. Any able-bodied farm worker who was not drafted to serve in the military in the first go-round was lured away from the farm by high-paying jobs in the munitions and military supply factories and the ports, like in Hoboken. For every man who must shoulder a rifle for military duty, we had better furnish an inducement for another to take up a hoe for farm work, the New York Times warned. And here's another. You see a drawing that appeared in Life magazine with the specter of hunger haunting the farmer. A few possible solutions were floated around. One was use convicts to work on farms. By the way, all of these were used in some places, in some ways. Use male office workers who would go to the gym during the week to get strong enough to do farm work on the weekends. Use conscription to raise an agricultural army. There was actually bills in Congress to do this. Use schoolboys who were too young to join the military, and they joined what was called the Boys' Working Reserve. there were discipline problems with the boys, shall we just say. They were all tried, but what the government refused to consider was using women. But women didn't mind. They were organizing themselves on their own. They were eager to serve. Here you see some wonderful recruitment posters, and some of them may be here. I haven't looked at all of them. Again, woman, your country needs you. Wake up, America. Civilization calls every man, woman, and child. This is for the National League for Women's Service, which was an umbrella group of women's organizations. This one actually was in Michigan. This is women, again, being urged to organize and to sign up to do war work. And in response to the food crisis, women around the country readied themselves to get their hands dirty. Women's organizations, including suffrage societies, of which there were many at this point, women's colleges, gardening clubs, civic clubs, the YWCA, the National League for Women's Service, again, that umbrella group, all began to train women on their own to assume agricultural work with little help from, or no help from the government. Women knew how to organize themselves. They'd been doing it for years in the suffrage movement, in the labor movement, going back in the abolition movement, and in various social reform movements. Here you see some women in Chicago. Get a load of those hats. So just 3 weeks after America entered the war, again, this is all grassroots, this is all women doing it on their own, a large-scale training farm opened on 200 acres in the Bronx, which was still a rural area of New York. 700 women enrolled for the first class in farm training, and there were weekend classes for working women, and 1,200 high school girls signed up for training. Another large training farm opened on the grounds of the State School of Agriculture at Farmingdale, where women learned to drive tractors, which was really important because it gave them a mechanical advantage to doing heavy work. And they also learned to drive these tractors, and here you see them learning, at night using headlights. And that was really something very different. Barely a month after America entered the war, the suffrage organizations in every single state appointed a chairwoman of agriculture. Chairman of potatoes being the title in which they rejoice, is the way it was reported in the Suffrage News. The National Service School outside Washington, D.C. Oh, here is actually the head of suffrage in New York State, Mrs. Litt, in her homemade gardening, farming outfit on her farm. The National Service School opened outside of Washington, D.C., run by the League of Women's Service. And it was in its second year of training women. They were preparing women in case we went to war. And they were teaching them things that they might need if we were in war, like nutrition, first aid, bandaging, signaling. Again, it was very military. They wore uniforms. They lived in tents. They did these marching drills. Here they are signaling. I think they're spelling out YMCA. And with the food crisis and America's entry into war, they begin to train women to farm. And farmeretting costumes, as they were called, became all the rage. Here you are. There were patterns in women's magazines to buy them, and all the department stores had them. Here there were different outfits, and then there was one that went very, very wrong. This was in the newspaper. It's very sad. Women's colleges took the lead in this Women on the Land movement. Vassar College, any Vassar grads here? There you go. Vassar College asked its students to take over its 750-acre farm in which it fed all the student body and all the faculty and all the staff. And suddenly there was nobody to work it. And so they began working at 4:30 in the morning, and here's some pictures of them, and worked a grueling 8-hour day. And they did such a fantastic job that they brought in all the crops and everyone was able to be fed. Bryn Mawr College, any Bryn Mawr? Women also took up plows, led by their young dean, Helen Taft, who was an historian, daughter of former President William Howard Taft, who pulled on bloomers, here she is, and in her own words, chose farming as my form of patriotic service, with the satisfaction of knowing that there is no form of work which is more needed. 400 Mount Holyoke women worked on their college farm in Massachusetts, summoned by their president, Mary Woolley, who made this appeal to them. The college farm is a training camp for young women, just as military camps are training for our men. Consider your work on the farm this summer as a step similar to that of the enlistment of your brothers. It is work not for the college, but for your country. You know, those were pretty stirring words. But the most ambitious experiment of this first summer of the war was the Women's Agricultural Camp in Bedford, New York, near Mount Kisco. And it was sponsored by Barnard College. Any Barnard? It was led by Professor Ida Ogilvy, here she is in her Land Army uniform, who was also chair of the Barnard Geology Department. The purpose of the camp was not only to train women to do agriculture and to do strenuous work, which they hadn't done before, but also to experiment with living and working arrangements on a large scale. Work out the logistics of how were they going to deploy city women into rural areas around the country, how to feed them, how to transport them. So they came up with something called the unit system, where women farm workers, unlike in England where they lived with the farmer's family, here they would live communally on their own in a sort of pastoral sorority house. People would be asked to lend a house on their property or a barn. Very often they lived in the horse stalls. So they lived together, and they brought their own cook or hired a cook and a chaperone, and they hired themselves out to work for the farmers in that area as independent contractors. And this system had many advantages. It allowed them to have more control over working conditions. It also allowed them to make the case that it was okay to send your daughter to be a Land Army farmerette, because they weren't going to be living in the farmer's house. They were going to be chaperoned. They were going to be in their own house. But it allowed them, because they were independent contractors, to make demands like an 8-hour day, which was not at all usual, even in industry, but certainly not in farming at the time. They also demanded equal pay to male workers, something we've not yet accomplished. And they did. They got $2 a day, which was the going rate, 25 cents an hour. And here are these great pictures of the Bedford camp. And another thing that they demanded was control over attire. You'll notice in these pictures, no skirts. Skirts would get in the way, and they were dangerous when you were using farm machinery and just cumbersome. So they said, no, we're going to wear overalls or a uniform or bloomers or something. And it was very controversial. This shocked many communities. It also allowed for something of a social mix in the camp, and that was part of the purpose. It allowed women of all economic classes and educational backgrounds and ethnicities, not race, it was still segregated. But here the working woman, the woman of leisure, the student, the shop girl, the factory worker, the immigrant would all work and live together in very close, intimate quarters, just like their brothers were doing in the military. And so it was seen as a step towards integrating everyone into our democracy. It was assumed that the college women would be sort of the brains of the organizations, and the tradeswomen or the shop girls would provide the brawn for the camp. But this stereotypical class distinction just shattered as soon as they got into the field. And one Bedford camp recruit put it most pungently. She said, "Be it said, to the credit of both, that the college girls were found to be the most husky young animals, fit for the hardest of labor, and that the trade school girls displayed splendid executive power. For once in the world, ability was the sole standard. She who hoed best, hoed. She who directed best, shouldered that responsibility. And blue shirts and overalls made distinctions impossible. Of course, at first, no farmers would employ them. Gradually, one farmer would try, and pleased, he'd tell his friends that they worked out pretty well. Remember, there were just very few farmhands left for them to hire. By the end of the season in Bedford, 100 farmers had hired the farmerettes, and there was a waiting list to employ them. And here, beyond their accomplishments in the field, the farmerettes made political statements, too, about labor issues, about, like, equal pay and the 8-hour day, and about women in the workplace, and about the role of women in wartime, because this was a really radical change, and about suffrage, because the suffragists embraced the land army as a great way to prove their patriotism in wartime. If they could prove they were patriotic and they were doing their bit, then they deserved the vote. And so they embraced the land army and other work for the war with great enthusiasm. Now, of course, women had always worked on the farm. It's not like women had never worked. They'd always worked, but they'd always been the farm wife or the farm daughter or the farm sister. They'd never been outsiders. They'd never been city girls, and they'd never been paid. So this was a very different thing for the farmers to try to get used to, too. And this was a different kind of war work, even for women in the cities. It was beyond the accepted role that the government saw women taking in this war, and that was the domestic sphere. So they expected women to do knitting and rolling bandages and caring for the sick and conserving sugar and making meatless Monday and wheatless Wednesday recipes. And that was, considered a woman's patriotic role, and it was, but it was limiting. It was just an outgrowth of the domestic sphere. And the land army women said, no, we want to do something different. And so here you see, again, the government's idea was to be patriotic by pledging to save food. And you all know that there was not rationing during World War I. There was during World War II. It was to be voluntary rationing. And so there were a huge amount of publicity to try to get women who were the managers of the household to prepare to not use certain foods that were needed for the war effort. So they were expected to be a kitchen soldier, or a soldier of the garbage pail, or a Hoover helper. Now, Herbert Hoover was actually the food administrator, and he was called the food czar. And this is where he made his mark, and this was his entry into politics. And he... his idea was to get women to voluntarily do these things and not under the compulsion of rationing. He said that wasn't American. And so there were, again, these efforts. There was even a Hoover helper uniform. You were supposed to wear this in your house. And there were patterns how to make it. They had lots of pockets. And I've actually met women who said their mothers talked about their house dresses as Hoovers. And there was even a penalty for breaking that pledge. And if someone, like a Girl Scout, saw you using too much sugar in your tea, yes, there was spying too, you might find this sign on your kitchen window. How's that for social shaming? We think it's new. It's not new. Again, the suffragists were very involved in this, and many leaders of the suffrage movement became leaders of the Women's Land Army. So by the fall of 1917, the farmerettes had proved themselves in the field, and the farmers asked if they could come back. And the experiment was such a success that now is a question of making this into a national organization. It had been based in the New York area, and now it was going to go national. So in December of 1917, a consortium of women's groups, ranging from the Garden Club of America to the Women's National Farm and Garden Association, the Cosmopolitan Club, to the Association of Collegiate Alumni, which is what we now know as the American Association of University Women, and suffrage organizations, and even anti-suffrage organizations, got together and established the Women's Land Army of America. And an elaborate recruitment and publicity campaign sent Land Army speakers to schools and factories and colleges and women's clubs. And here we see one of my favorite posters, again, that just oozing with patriotism and the flag and the colors. New Jersey began organizing its land army in February 1918. And from the very beginning, it was able to attract influential supporters, both men and women. On its letterhead, it boasted an advisory committee, which included U.S. Senator Joseph Frelinghuysen, Princeton University President John Grier Hibben, the State Secretary of Agriculture, and the Dean of the State Agricultural School in New Brunswick. The governor even offered the Land Army a headquarters office in the State House in Trenton, rent-free. Josephine Perry Morgan became the state finance chairman. She was in Princeton. It was a fitting role, as she had married into the House of Morgan when she married J. Pierpont Morgan's nephew. And let's see, here are some of the great recruitment posters. This is again from the YWCA. The girl on the land serves the nation's need. Get behind the girl he left behind him. This was a sort of membership organization, like you would support public radio or public television. You were to give some money. This is from Ohio, having her shovel on her shoulder like a rifle. Again, another New Jersey poster. And here is Josephine Morgan, who was a masterful fundraiser, and she proved to be a very savvy and imaginative Land Army administrator. She devised a multi-tiered fundraising system, the most elaborate in the whole country, that extended from the wallets of wealthy women who she had no compunction about asking for money, to selling Farmerette jams and fruit pies and asking for $1 membership donations. New Jersey launched a recruitment and publicity campaign which was the envy of the other states. They had a speakers bureau. So Land Army supporters would go to schools and clubs and public meetings, but they also trained what were called 4-minute women. You've heard of the 4-minute men who would get up and give a rousing speech about doing something for the war effort. Well, these were 4-minute women who would pop up in a movie theater just when you were trying to see the movie, and they would deliver a punchy advertisement for the Land Army before the film rolled. There was a news bureau which assigned one farmerette in each unit to serve as a journalist, and she was tasked with reporting and writing up stories and articles, and these were then sent to Trenton, where there was a press bureau that would create articles that were then fodder for feature articles in all the state newspapers. Photographers and film crews were sent to document the work of the New Jersey farmerettes and produce images which would be distributed not just in news outlets, but also in schools and libraries. The state's largest newspaper at the time, the Newark Evening News, devoted a full month of coverage to the Land Army, just at the crucial time of spring recruitment. And the paper established a fund for the New Jersey Women's Land Army, which solicited donations from readers for the cause. And the Jersey Land Army used, here we are, here are New Jersey women in the field. Here they are. And the Jersey Land Army used the Charles Dana Gibson poster, which is being raffled off, as their public face. And these were tacked up to fences and walls and posted on giant billboards. So you would have seen that all over New Jersey. And then there was my favorite publicity stunt. A Land Army woman was placed in full uniform with her tools in the windows of Wanamaker's department store. And that in downtown Newark. And that definitely stopped traffic. I wish I had a picture of that, but I don't. Again, these are all New Jersey women in the field. New Jersey put 32 units in the field. A unit could be anything from 10 women to 200 women. including some of the most unusual and colorful units in the country. A unit of 60 farmerettes worked at the Seabrook Farms in Cumberland County, and Charles Franklin Seabrook, who became known as the Henry Ford of farming because he brought the lessons of modern factory to the farm, was so eager for the women to work that he actually rented a large house for them and hired a cook and drivers. One unit at New Brunswick worked for Johnson & Johnson, picking belladonna, which was a highly poisonous but very useful battlefield medicine that was in demand, of course, because of the war. The farmerettes were issued gloves and stern instructions not to sample the sweet berries of deadly nightshade, because it was very poisonous. There were no reported casualties. The New Jersey Land Army organizers came up with an ingenious solution, also this is one of my favorites, to a sticky problem. There was a large unit of 50 Land Army volunteers, all Sabbath-observant Jewish girls who could not work on Saturdays. And this was difficult to assign them to a farm because usually they did work on Saturdays. Came up with a brilliant solution. They were placed with Seventh-day Adventist farmers in Cumberland County who were also observed a Saturday Sabbath and did not work on that day, and everybody was happy. Another fascinating unit I found was the Polish-speaking one stationed in Holmdel. Am I pronouncing that right? Holmdel? And they were recruited from the immigrant Polish community in Newark. The women were eager to prove their patriotism and devotion to their adopted country, and they enrolled enthusiastically, but there was one hitch. They insisted on taking their children with them. Now, this is the only instance I came across in the whole country of a Land Army daycare center. But they hired the principal of a local school to take care of the children while their mothers were in the field. And they worked hard. They were digging potatoes 8 hours a day, paid 10 cents a barrel, and most of the women could dig 40 barrels a day. One dynamo set a record of 81 barrels in a single day. Now, their husbands had been a little skeptical about this whole endeavor. They thought the work was too difficult and that they prophesied that they'd return in a week. Well, they didn't return. And the husbands, when they didn't return, took the train out to the farm to see them. And they were surprised how healthy and how happy the women and the children seemed to be. And for the rest of the season, the families, husbands, grandma, cousins, would all come out to the farmerette camp and enjoy a festive Polish Sunday dinner together. The farmers in New Jersey, again, here's some more farmer pictures. The farmers of New Jersey, as in elsewhere in the nation, were at first very skeptical about women workers. At first, there's great reluctance, the farmer being very conservative. And then he comes around, said a New Jersey Land Army officer, and then he wants more farmerettes. The evolution is best captured, and again, this happened all over the country, just this way, by the Red Bank, New Jersey Register, which described its town's reaction to the arrival of the Land Army unit. The agriculturalists of this vicinity, said the newspaper, of Tinton Falls, do not have the deep-seated distrust of farmerettes, which seem to be the general among farmers of other parts of this country. The reason for this is that Tinton Falls farmers have had a demonstration of the efficiency of the girl farmhands. John Anderson was the only man in the locality who had enough faith in the girls to give them a tryout, the newspaper said. Tinton Falls farmers were all doubting Thomases when the girls first arrived, and Mr. Anderson came in for a lot of joshing about his girl farmhands. Opinion was divided in the village as to whether the girls were a lot of fanciful females anxious to gain notoriety, or whether they were a lot of well-intentioned persons who had undertaken a job they couldn't perform. As time wore on, and folks saw the girls working in the fields, doubt gave way to a sort of grudging admiration for the farmerettes. The farmers quit jollying Mr. Anderson about his new farmhands, and at length their prejudice against the feminine workers was displaced by appreciation of the pluck and efficiency of the girls. And by the end of September, there was this headline in that Red Bank newspaper: Farmers regret to see farmerettes return to their homes and want to employ them again next year. All over the nation in 1918, farmerettes were at work. Here we see some pictures in California, where there were more than 5,000 farmerettes, and even a saboteur who was court-martialed by the Land Army and kicked out of the Corps. Again in California, the most amazing tractor I've ever seen. In Massachusetts. In North Carolina. This is in Greensboro. These are women at the Teachers College in Greensboro. You'll notice they are wearing skirts. In the South, it was just considered too outrageous to wear pants, and so they gave in and they allowed them to wear skirts. But notice the hats. They made up for it with the hats. Again, here are the North Carolina women. Here they are in Illinois, at the Illinois Training Farm for Women, which was a very large enterprise. Again in Illinois. In Maryland, not far from where I live. Here they are in Maryland again. Again, they're wearing... it's hard for us to understand how really controversial it was for them to be dressed like this. Here's one who's quite well-dressed and showing off. Here in New York. Again in New York State. This is at the National Service School, their third year, and they're training, again, women to use tractors, which was really important. And this is in New Mexico. And again in New Mexico, where the girls are taking a little break in the horse trough. In Ohio. In northern Vermont, they're dusting potatoes. In Pennsylvania, Kennett Square. That's a Kennett Square unit. I love that picture. And then let me just tell you that in Connecticut, the farmerettes were asked to pick tobacco to provide the troops with cigarettes and cigars. And this was really controversial because even then it was considered the evil weed, and should women's patriotic work be used to give women to give soldiers tobacco. And there was a lot of controversy back and forth whether they should be allowed to do this. But then they saw this sign from General Pershing saying that his troops needed smokes more than anything else, and so they relented. And here's a group of women who were Connecticut women who were picking tobacco. And in Augusta, Georgia, here's a group. They picked cotton. White women picking cotton. That was very, very controversial and caused quite a stir. So by the summer of 1918, this is now the second year of their existence, the farmerette has become quite famous. She's in advertisements. She's used in advertisements here for Fairy Seeds. Her uniform has become a fashion statement. Here's a brochure for it. Again, you will have a natty costume. And this was made by Best & Company. And the buckle for the belt was made by Gorham Silver. So it wasn't silver, but it was struck by Gorham. So it was a very top-notch kind of uniform. She had her own newspaper, aptly called the Farmerette. She was asked to march in the Liberty Loan parades. This is going down Fifth Avenue in New York in the fall of 1918 to raise money. And she is also, let me just go back a little bit, she appears in the Ziegfeld Follies. And this song with lyrics by P.G. Wodehouse. Yes, P.G. Wodehouse spent the war years in England. Well, actually, he was in New York, writing Broadway songs, and music by Victor Herbert. And this appeared in the Ziegfeld Review. And here's a snippet of the lyrics. Every girl, says Mr. Hoover, finds that farm work will improve her. From the city he'd remove her to become a farmerette. Ever since they introduced her for the farm, each girl's a booster and her closest friend's a rooster, now that she's a farmerette. You can imagine. The Land Army even had its own West Point, its officers' training school. It was at the Wellesley Training Camp and Experiment Station on the grounds of Wellesley College in Massachusetts. It was the most ambitious and audacious adventure of the Land Army. The camp was run by this woman, Miss Edith Deal. You would not want to cross Miss Deal, who at the time was one of the most famous bookbinders in the world. Deal wanted the Wellesley camp to be much more than just an Aggie school for women. It should be a great outdoor laboratory for testing and probing and measuring the capacity of women to undertake strenuous labor and quickly master new skills and assume leadership roles. These were the skills Miss Deal thought women were going to need to lead the Land Army and to meet their duties in the greater war effort, and also to assume their place in the unfolding 20th century. So the women learned carpentry and plumbing skills and helped to build the camp themselves, and here you see it. She brought in a professional staff of women, a woman physician to conduct the physical exams, a psychologist to administer aptitude tests, a nutritionist to design the correct diet for women engaged in hard labor, and a driving instructor, because Miss Deal felt all women should learn to drive. It would give them independence, and here is the driving instructor. And for physical training, she called in the Marines. 3 times each week, 2 drill instructors from the Charleston Naval Yard in Boston came to camp and led the women in exercises and foot movements and drills. And they also conducted inspections. And here they are doing push-ups. And since Deal was also a firm believer in the importance of efficiency and a devotee of the new concepts of scientific work management, she also brought to camp the most famous practitioner of efficiency in the day, Frank Bunker Gilbreth. Does that name ring a bell to anyone? Gilbreth's manic devotion to efficiency in both his work and his life was later made famous by his children's memoir, Cheaper by the Dozen. And Edith Deal brought both Frank and his wife Lillian, they were both engineers, to the Land Army camp to train the women in how to be more efficient. He used lantern slides to teach the women how to eliminate waste motion. They experimented with size of farm tools and what would be the most ergonomic way of handling them. And the women were timed with a stopwatch to see which would be the most efficient type of rest. Should they have 2 10-minute rests an hour or 5 5-minute rests? They were experimenting with this. And from the trial and error of this camp, this grand laboratory, Miss Deal drew a blueprint for a permanent women's land army. There were ambitious plans to put 100, 200, perhaps 300,000 women in the field in the next planting season. And to help prepare for this 1919 season, in early October, the New Jersey Land Army staged a fundraising benefit at the Mount Holly Theater. I don't know if it still exists. It featured 2 short plays, a patriotic tableau. They love these tableaus. Remember Grecian Urn from Music Man? That's what it was like. And 2 moving pictures of farmerettes at work. And the program urged the audience to become members of the Land Army, again, like public radio, and to donate necessary supplies. And the finale featured a stirring rendition of a farmerette song dedicated to the women of the Land Army with the chorus, "We are the girls of the land, and for liberty we take our stand. We'll fight for the right with all our might as we march with our hoe in our hand." And then peace came in November of 1918. But the Land Army had to keep going because the influenza epidemic meant that the men and the farm workers were not going to be returning to the farms anytime soon. They were in quarantine. And even if they did come back, remember the famous song of the time, how you're going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris, a lot of those farm workers were not going to go back to the farm. So the Women's Land Army decided to keep going on. And Mrs. Morgan sent, again, another fundraising letter to everybody saying, this has to go on. The farmers need us. The workers are not coming back this season. And the Land Army did continue into the field in 1919 and even expanded into new states which had been reluctant to have Land Army before: Nebraska, South Dakota, Florida. In May 1919, a new women's cooperative training farm opened in Leonardo, New Jersey, in the southern part of the state. It was run by the New Jersey Land Army with a curriculum designed by Edith Deal. And there were 2-week training courses, and it was considered a great success. It went all through the season. More than a dozen units were at work in New Jersey fields in 1919, after the war was over. But soon, financial pressures finally became untenable, even for Mrs. Morgan, and the New Jersey division of the Land Army closed its doors. By the fall of 1919, the Land Army had run out of money. Suffragists had turned their attention to ratifying the 19th Amendment, which you can learn about in my next book, and the Women's Land Army disbanded. Here they are again. This was the fundraising that was going on in the fall of 1918. Okay, we're going to go. But just about 20 years later, there was another war, and there was a dangerous shortage of farm labor again, and the government had no plan again. But there were women who had been farmerettes in the First War who remembered how to organize. And on their own, they began establishing local land armies in different states. And their loudest champion was the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, who pushed her husband over the objection of the Agriculture Secretary to establish the Women's Land Army of the Second World War. And here's a picture of a mother and a daughter. The mother is on the right, and she's in the World War I outfit, and the daughter is on the left in the World War II. And there were more than 250,000 women involved in that, but it was a government-run organization at that time. So although the farmerette of World War I hasn't gotten the recognition she deserves, at least I think she deserves, until very recently, my book was the first written about it, she does occasionally pop up in popular culture. You know the musical Guys and Dolls, where Miss Adelaide sings A Bushel and a Peck? Well, behind her are the farmerettes. And those are taken from Damon Runyon's stories of New York in the 1920s. And that's when the farmerette would have been in very much in memory. It also even pops up now. Before my book came out, I found this on, that again, the very famous iconic recruitment poster, and I found this on the internet. Again, before my book came out. Who knew about this? How could they do this? It had no cultural or historic context. It was just a pretty picture. You could even get a thong. I mean, I was really surprised. But I hope that now you have some understanding of what that poster means and what the Land Army meant to America and to New Jersey. And I hope you'll be inspired to explore in more depth the women of the suffrage movement who come out of the Land Army or were part of the Land Army, and the way they valiantly fought for our right to vote. And that's the subject of my, here is another, that's the old book. And this is the new book, which you have a postcard. And again, this is about how we won the vote. And I'd like to end with a little audience participation. I think we have that. There we go. A sing-along. We're going to imagine we're at a recruitment meeting, which would happen all over New Jersey, I'm sure in Hoboken too. And this song was often sang. And it is to the tune of Battle Hymn of the Republic, so we know that. And so join me, and we will join the Land Army. Okay, here we go. Our Mother Earth has called us, for the nations we must feed. We have rallied to her standard to produce our greatest need. We will labor on her bosom and achieve that worthy deed as we go working on.
We'll skip.
We are told by Herbert Hoover that the war by food is won, so we're laboring at production from the dawn till set of sun. We have donned the khaki uniform to fight the mighty Hun, and we go working on. We are going to whip the Kaiser, and our hearts are unafraid. We will help to win this wicked war with hoe and rake and spade. Though our tasks be of the hardest, we will never be dismayed, but still go working on. We have joined our hands for service with our sisters across the sea. We have forged a mighty weapon in our fight for liberty. By the spirit of our labor in the Women's Land Army, and we go working on. Thank you very, very much.